rewrite the Human Declaration today, what would you add, what would you elaborate or maybe eliminate? And most of the answers are actually that it is more or less a complete document. Of course, one could have complaints about the participatory aspects, that not all countries or parts of the world were included at the time when it was written. Also today we have challenges concerning capital punishment. For example, it was not included the capital punishment, a negative stance towards capital punishment in the document. Also, of course, one could expand the anti-discrimination list with new grounds for discrimination. So there are, of course, room for improvement, but I would say my personal view is that it is more or less a perfect document. Just to add, actually, the former Prime Minister of UK, Gordon Brown, he will be presenting probably a new UN declaration in the end of the year. He had started a working group and they're trying to improve the UN declaration. I'm not sure really about that project, because I think in the end we will see that the UN declaration is more or less a perfect document. I take some material from a book that I published in Swedish, where I introduced a concept I call the human rights family. And this applies to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that you could see all the 30 articles as member of a human rights family. They are members of a family where interdependence, interrelatedness and indivisibility is seen as the main characteristics. This is also in tune with Article 30 of the UN Declaration and the Vienna Declaration of Human Rights 1993, where these concepts were introduced in connection to human rights. Some members are parents in the sense that they are absolute and foundational. Here I would especially mention the right not to be tortured and the right not to be enslaved. Also, freedom of thought is an absolute right, which is also a core element of freedom of religion. While other rights could be more seen as siblings. What are siblings? Well, take for example freedom of expression, association, but also freedom of religion, except for forum internum, the so-called freedom of thought, which is an absolute right. The siblings have to adjust to one another, and they are not absolute rights. They have qualifications of various kinds. The absolute rights do not have that. So we come to Article 18 in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is the freedom of religion article. And everyone here is very familiar with this right. And actually it is often the natural starting point for freedom of religion discussions concerning it as a human right. It's a very, very substantial article, actually. When you read it, you see that there are so many concepts included in it which have actually very substantial implication. The article, the origin of the article is an interesting story in itself. The two main writers of the UN Declaration, Charles Malik and Peng Chang, were responsible for this article. They were both philosophers, very, very talented persons. I would not like to downgrade the role of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was, of course, very, very important, but Malik and Chang, I would say, were the main architects of the UN Declaration. And it's interesting to see that Malik came from Lebanon and Chang from China. The challenges or threats to freedom of religion, of course, they are political. And this conference has mainly focused upon the political challenges. Oppression of religious minorities from other religious groups, especially religious majorities. But also the direct or indirect discrimination from the state. But we could also identify intellectual, ideological or philosophical challenges. For example, questioning the reasonableness of freedom of religion as a distinct human right. I will not have time to go through all the kinds of criticism that can be raised to freedom of religion at different levels. On one hand, of course, you can criticize human rights generally, and that also implies, of course, a challenge of freedom of religion specifically. Cultural relativism, Marxist critique, etc. You can have a long list of critical perspectives throughout history or the post-war period. Especially in the context of Africa, cultural relativism is often seen as a common criticism of the UN Declaration. One could of course criticize religion, atheist perspective, but also criticize freedom or the right to change one's religion in theocratic states. But the more kind of recent philosophical debate, the criticize the distinctiveness of the right to freedom of religion has appeared, for example, in Sweden in recent years, in the United States in recent years. And they often represent a so-called liberal, secular perspective. Also, it could be described as human rights reductionism. And the core element in that criticism is that why can't we be satisfied only with cultural rights, associational rights, conscience and belief, freedom of speech, etc.? Why do we need freedom of religion when we have all these other rights? This position is represented by famous American philosopher James Nichol, also French philosopher Cécile Laborde. Ronald Dworkin, in the last book he wrote before he died, Religion Without a God, he also was an advocate of a so-called reductionist view when he thought that the concept of ethical independence was the main concept instead. Why the urge for reductionism? Well, of course, simplicity, the epistemic ideal that a theory or a scheme of rights is more reasonable if it's characterized by as few principles as possible. And also one could have linked to that an emphasis upon the so-called most salient ethical features, such as conscience, which is represented by the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. And connected often to these kind of criticisms is one wants to get rid of a so-called unfair positive treatment of religious identities and convictions in comparison to non-religious beliefs. Religion also unreasonable in the atheist perspective. Often one could also see in the attempts to get rid of freedom of religion that the fight for freedom of religion has to some extent been linked in recent years to conservative political agendas in some countries. Preserve, for example, collective religious autonomy, suppressing individual freedom of religion instead of collective freedom of religion. And point B here, freedom of religion as a collective right undermines it as an individual right. This is often an assumption. And also that freedom of religion often seems to clash with other cherished rights, such as freedom of expression and anti-discrimination principles. In metaphorical terms, one could say freedom of religion is a messy member of the human rights family. But I have some responses to this criticism, that human rights declarations such as the UN Declaration can't be compared to ethical theories such as utilitarianism or duty ethics, that may have as their desiderata simplicity and the urge for so-called master concepts. Rights declarations are responses to historical situation, atrocities such as discrimination, with the purpose of preventing this to happen again. That was the purpose of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The main purpose, as the writers Malik and Chang often emphasized, was to raise the moral stature of man in the light of global challenges and atrocities. And response 2, the struggle for freedom of religion has often been linked to the fight for other freedoms. How freedom of religion is respected could be seen as an indicator how our freedoms and rights are respected, which is a research result from Brian Grimm and Roger Finke in their book The Price of Freedom Denied. In UN documents such as UN Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of religion is often seen also as primarily an individual right, not as a collective right, which is very important to stress at a conference like this. Other rights also clashes with other rights in the human rights family. Freedom of religion is not the only one. And also it could be seen actually as a precondition for other rights. To deny freedom of religion the status of being a distinct human rights sends also signals of a degradation of religious freedom. To take away freedom of religion has negative effects on the other members of the human rights family. Freedom of religion throughout history has been a catalyst for other human rights and freedom. And as the famous sociologist Peter Berger have said, religions have also functioned as critical vantage points vis-à-vis political states. I was talking about the motivations for reductionism. Often reductionism can be facilitated if you are operating under certain assumptions. You have often in a reductionist view of freedom of religion, intellectualized view of religion. Religions are primarily belief systems. That makes it more easy in a way to reduce freedom of religion to other human rights. However, many religions include practices also at an individual levels in all walks of life, not only within associations or for groups. Hence, freedom of belief and freedom of association are not enough to explain freedom of religion. One could also say that freedom of religion is not exposed to some of the common criticism of human rights. For example, Marxism and cultural relativism. Article 18 does not express an individualistic view of man. Religion is often practiced in communities and in public arenas. Number two, not a cultural parochial right that only reflects limited cultural tradition. Religions could be seen as universal throughout the history of mankind. For example, in comparison to nation states. And one could also here add that religious rights and freedom are beneficial for the human rights family as a whole. As the Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Religion, Heiner Bielefeld, has said, freedom of religion it gives empowerment to human beings. It makes it possible to think about life, humanity, and the world in the most overarching terms and act in accordance to those thoughts and beliefs. It's also beneficial for the human rights scheme as a whole if one endorses the view that religious philosophical reflections are important for the formulations and justifications of human rights. The human rights articles can in other words, be embedded in various religious frameworks. So it's a very useful member in the human rights family. It could be seen as especially useful or natural in the light of human dignity as a foundation for human rights. Man's search for ultimate meaning and understanding is an important part of being a human in comparison to animals. Hence, respect for human dignity implies respect for freedom of religion. Human dignity presents also a general or all-encompassing foundation for all members of the human rights family. Freedom of religion receives a secure place in the human rights family on the basis of human dignity. It means respect not only for basic needs and human agency, but also for a person's will and ability to express herself through overarching existential interpretations of the world. I will end with a quotation from Learned Hand, the writer, The Spirit of Liberty. It's, I think, a very suitable ending. It's about on the limits of rights schemes, laws, declarations and conventions. Irrespectively how good a human rights scheme is, the source of morality lies elsewhere. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. Hence, the UN Declaration should mainly be seen as a moral educational project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Roth. Now we go to our next speaker, Dr. Ingvar.